In the past few weeks, the conversations and questions around Nigeria's crude oil production have heightened after the discovery of a tapped pipeline in the Niger Delta region. Now, officials of the Nigeria National Petroleum Company say that the crude oil has been siphoned from that one pipeline for the past 9 years. The numbers around the theft of Nigerian crude are staggering. Bala Wunti, the group general manager of the National Petroleum Investment Management Services, said that Nigeria is losing about $700 million per day due to oil bunkering. In the past several months, Nigeria has failed to meet its agreed OPEC Plus production quota and was overtaken by Angola for the title of Africa's largest crude oil producer. How is the theft happening, and do the numbers add up? My guest today is Zeal Akaraiwe. He's the CEO and founder of Graeme Blaque Advisory. He provides advisory services for participants in the oil and gas sector. And before starting his business, was also in oil and gas while in the banking industry. Zeal, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much, Tolu.
Thanks. So let's start with the narrative. There's a lot of sort of narrative that's been set in terms of this situation, and that one of it is that these massive tankers are somehow strolling into Nigerian waters and coastlines, loading some millions of barrels of crude oil and then strolling out. You know what I mean if you stroll on water. But what do you think of this narrative? Is it really that easy to steal crude oil from Nigeria?
That specific narrative is not entirely correct. If you understand how the whole thing works, a ship doesn't just waltz into the country, connect to a pipeline, load up and leave. We have ships coming on a daily basis to load crude from different export terminals, all of them scheduled. What I've found to be the most likely explanation for how crude is stolen in that manner is that the vessels have the payment, the documentation for loading liquids generally would have a leeway of plus or minus, say, 10% variation. So a 3 million barrel tanker would come into the country. It can load 3 million and leave, and all the paperwork would support that. If it manages to load 3.3 million, for argument's sake, which is within the plus or minus 10% variation, then that means that it has taken 300,000 barrels unofficially, if that 300 is not through the official means. So that vessel is going to leave with 3.3 million, even though it was scheduled to load 3 million, but all the supporting documents, because of the plus or minus 10% variation, will still cover for the extra crude of 300,000 barrels.
So I like the fact that you're getting us into the documentation part of it, because this narrative wants the public to believe that these vessels are getting around Nigeria's Navy, around the Air Force, as well as radar and even satellite tracking, and managing somehow to do this undetected. So the scenario you sort of play out shows us two possibilities. One, individual vessels that are fully involved in illegally taking crude from Nigeria, and vessels that have proper documentation to take a certain amounts of crude, but are also having an additional amount of crude possibly loaded on them. So how would all of this play out, particularly with the Navy documentation, the Air Force, and even radar and satellites situations that we should be seeing in play?
So with what I've described, there's little or no way to point it out. There's no way. I don't know how you can detect it. So the vessel is scheduled to load 3 million barrels, and it comes in and it loads 2.7, which is minus 10% of what it should load. And then it also, in addition, loads 600,000 from, let's say, unofficial sources of stolen crude. So that vessel will come in with documentation to load 3 million barrels plus or minus 10%. And it will leave with 3 million barrels plus 10%. So when you check the documentation, the amount of crude it's carrying is confirmed or is consistent with the documentation it carries. So between all the Navy and all the checks, it's not very easy to detect when the theft is done in that manner.
So if we're saying that it's difficult for us to detect the theft sort of at the end of the, I guess, pipeline or maybe value chain of this, then let's look about the production end of things. Nigeria at one point was producing about 1.8 million barrels of crude oil. And then you had a situation where the country is down to around 1 million, some even say around 900,000 barrels of crude oil. Now, the conversation around Nigeria's production capacity and what is being stolen is one of the very critical parts of this conversation, but it's also in contention. So how does Nigeria track its production? Also, given the fact that Nigeria does have a quota from OPEC Plus, which you have unfortunately failed to meet in the past few months, who's doing the plus or minus in the calculation? What are the numbers or the figures along this equation?
So that's a good question, Tolu. If you check the terminology used by the NNPC, the use of the word loss is far more common than the use of the word theft. So there's a lot of oil being siphoned in between the production and the export terminals. So for argument's sake, you produce 100 barrels at the production site, at the platform or whatever, and then you pump it all the way to the export terminal. What gets to the export terminal may be 50 barrels. So in between, 50 barrels have been siphoned one way or the other illegally through all sorts of weird connections. What happens then is at the production platform, we record the production of 100. At the export terminal, we record 50. What OPEC tracks would be your export volumes, I believe. But that discrepancy is now what causes the problem. 50 is lost or stolen. But what then would happen is you may find that that particular production terminal, instead of losing 50 barrels of its production, decides to shut down completely and stops pumping. In which case, the 50 being stolen is no longer stolen, but the 100 being produced is also not being produced. So as a country, we're losing 100 barrels of production, even though theft is now zero. The reason we're losing 100 barrels of production is because of a shut-in caused by 50 barrels of theft. So the terminology has to be very clear. A lot of producers have stopped pumping because of all these leakages along the way to the export terminals. And all of that reduction in pumping is what NNPC says we used to produce 1.8, we're now at 1 million. It's not that 800 in total is being stolen. A lot of that is also because of shut-ins.
So more numbers in this conversation. So between January and July, Nigeria, which was Africa's biggest oil producer, lost an average of 437,000 barrels of oil a day. And this is what officials of the NNPC are saying. And this is to criminal entities and individuals who are illicitly tapping the pipelines. Now, at the current prices, the stolen oil is worth more than about $10 billion, which is the equivalent of 4.3 trillion naira, using the official rate of around 430 naira. This financial loss is more than 50% of Nigeria's external reserves. It is also more than double Nigeria's total revenue between January and April, which was a time when Nigeria's total revenue was unable to service its debt, and the country had to borrow for everything, including payment for workers. Zeal, do these numbers make sense? How much is really being lost in, I guess we would say, naira, kobo, and dollar cents?
Well, with the oil price hovering around $90 a barrel, if we were losing through theft, even if it's just 100 barrels per day, at $90 a barrel, that's $9 million per day. Over a 300 all day year, we're talking $2.5 to $2.3 billion. It's a lot, and that's just for 100,000 barrels a day. So what we're losing in monetary terms is massive. It's really huge. The issue we are having, or rather one of the issues we're having, is the fact that we seem to swing and stay on only one side of the pendulum. We're not very amenable to understanding there's more than one narrative to a single story. We're losing a lot of oil. We've been losing a lot of oil for decades. It didn't start today. It's gotten significantly worse over the last couple of years. Yes, I mean, in 2012, we were producing about 2.5 million barrels a day. But what many people also don't know is that one of the reasons oil production is reducing, apart from the theft or the leakages, is that the oil industry needs to spend anywhere between $8 and $12 billion every year just to maintain current production levels. Now, we know over the last couple of years, 8, 9 years or so, investment in that sector has significantly reduced for many reasons, one of them being our inability to pass the PIA and all of that. But there are many reasons why investment in that area has reduced. So oil production is a declining asset. If you do not invest, your production will reduce. We've not been investing the $8 to $12 billion every year to maintain production. So there will be a natural depreciation of production over that period. So that's one reason we're losing revenue. Theft is another reason. There is also the corruption-induced theft, which is different from the theft. So what I mean is this. The theft is the blatant illegalities of putting pipelines where there should be no pipelines and you're pumping crude into private vessels. That's theft. There's the corruption-induced theft where meters are tampered with and there's, what's the word? Collusion within the industry, within the company, within the NNPC over what is being taken out. And then there's also the lack of investment that's causing a decline in our production capacity.
So one aspect of this conversation I haven't heard many people focus on is how this stolen crude is then sold on the international markets. And crude on the international markets is meant to come with some form of documentation. So how do buyers of stolen Nigerian crude not know that it's stolen? Is there any way we can cut off the sellers at the international market point?
Yes, because crude is kind of, it's liquid, but the scrutiny around buying stolen crude really comes from the financial sector, the moving of dollars. There's a lot of scrutiny around how dollars are moved. So the first example I gave makes it extremely easy to buy stolen crude undetected, pay for it undetected, and yet have all the documentation that covers for it. That plus or minus 5 or 10% allowable discrepancy in the documentation, and that's a standard discrepancy allowance, especially because we're talking about a liquid. There's really no way you can get an exact amount of liquid into a vessel. So that discrepancy is allowed so that there is no delays in the payment. So a lot of the crude that bypasses all of this scrutiny, I believe very strongly, goes out in that plus or minus 5 or 10% allowable discrepancy in the loading volumes. Once that can be achieved, then it becomes very, very difficult to track the payments, and it becomes near impossible for the buyer to know what part of it is stolen and what part of it is not.
All right. And the images you're seeing on your screen are images of one of these illegal tankers or vessels that was found just a few days ago. Our correspondent was in the Niger Delta along with the heads of the NNPC and other agencies, and they found this vessel and they decided to burn it as well, which leads me to my next question, Zeal. Who has to be in on this? Who has to be complicit for such a situation such as this to continue for as long as it has? As you noted, Nigeria has had crude stolen for a very, very long time. There has been a significant drop in the past several months of our production, but that's a number of factors coming together in this present time and a circumstance. But beyond that, who has to be involved? Because this is not done by villagers in the creeks. It's not even done by the militants as we know them. This is a large-scale, cartelish, very illegal operation going on that has money involved. Who has to be involved, Zeal?
If we break down the different types of theft and leakages going on, then it becomes easy to see who's involved. So it's not just one type of theft. So there's the organized theft, and that needs the collusion of people at every level of the community. There are those who steal crude. Don't forget, there are the illegal refineries, those who bust pipelines or siphon from pipelines to refine the crude illegally. That is community-based. So the community would largely have a good idea who's involved and who's not. But when it gets onto getting stolen crude onto vessels, then you find that the collusion is kind of the entire chain. Different people at different parts playing different roles. Some choosing to ignore what's going on and thereby enforcing or allowing the theft and corruption to go on. Some turning a blind eye, some actively involved. And if you see the pictures and the videos of those pipelines being siphoned from, and if you understand that the type of equipment needed to achieve all of that without raising flags at the production terminals, you know that there's heavy equipment involved. So there's a long chain of collusion from people in the community to people high up in wherever it is that we're talking about.
All right, finally, Zeal, before I let you go, at the end of the day, Nigeria is bleeding revenue. The country is struggling to meet its debt servicing needs. There is environmental degradation from oil bunkering as well in the Niger Delta. How does Africa's largest crude oil producer, stop the bleeding?
The bleeding is something that's been going on for a very long time. And as my friend would very often say, when you have a problem, instead of solving the problem, you throw funds at the problem, then you create a well-funded problem, which is what we have in the oil industry. There is so much money that's being made illegally. But the thing is, a lot of the oil companies who are the ones producing and losing money have surveillance. They've spent a lot. I mean, a lot of these discoveries now, you have to ask, why is it now that these discoveries are coming up after a private entity was given a renewed contract to do the surveillance? We have a Navy, we have NIMASA, we have all the technology we have. I mean, you can go on a website and track the movement of literally any vessel in the world. Know where it is, what speed it's going at, where it stopped, how long it stayed, how many hours. All of that technology is available. The fact that we're not doing anything about it at that level, the fact that there is no punishment. So all of this, you hear someone has a list of all the people who are stealing the crude and nothing gets done. Not too long ago, as a slight digression, Tolu, we heard that there was a list of almost 1,000 people funding Boko Haram. And there's nothing being done about, I mean, there's nothing publicly being done about that. So when a society begins to see that there is no repercussion for breaking the law, then you find that breaking the law becomes a habit. So if we want to tackle this, we need to tackle it from the community level. And why is the community silent on this? There's a massive trust deficit between the local producing communities and the government. So it's not easy for the government to come to the community to elicit any type of help because the community already feels depraved. And for them, this is a way of getting the resource back into the community. We also have to look at the poverty and unemployment levels. We cannot divorce a lot of the, I'm not saying that is a cause, but I'm saying it's really hard to divorce the unemployment, the poverty, the general lack of productivity in the economy. It's hard to divorce all of that from a lot of the money-related corruption that's going on in the economy, starting from Boko Haram all the way down to oil theft. So those are the things we need to tackle. We need to look at the socio-economic situation of the country, starting with, again, poverty, unemployment, productivity, education levels. ASU's been on strike for 8 months, 9 months. All these students, youths with a lot of energy, a lot of creativity, sitting idle and bored, they are going to find something. And then there is little or no law enforcement to punish them or to guide them. It's just a recipe for disaster, Tolu.
A recipe for disaster and a hydra-headed monster for Nigeria's economy. Zeal Akaraiwe, I know this will not be the end of the conversation. We are hearing that a committee is being set up, and of course, the private security company has recently even arrested some vessels and individuals they say they found also bunkering oil. So it's going to continue to generate controversy, and there'll be more conversations around it. Thank you so much for joining me, Zeal.
Thank you, Tolu.
All right.